What's going on, guys? Welcome to Frank Analysis. I'm your host, Franco. We're going to get started with this stream by talking about the Nicaraguan elections. And we're going to start by showing you guys some of the results. We're going to go through some of the footage that people that are on the ground there, the Convo Couch, Ben Norton, Caleb Maupin, and what they're saying and how that's different from what the United States is saying about these elections. So, as of 3:35 p.m. on November 8th, 2021, which was yesterday, President Daniel Ortega is re-elected president of Nicaragua. The FSLN received 75.92% of the vote in Nicaragua's presidential and vice presidential race, with 97.74% of tally sheets scrutinized. Now, the global south tends to have more secure elections in the US. And we're going to hear testimony from people who are there on the ground to see what they heard. Venezuela has secure elections. We've discussed that on this show, based off of research from the Center for Economic and Policy Research. But regardless, the US is still going to try to impose, and they're going to try everything that they can to remove or stop a leftist leader from becoming or staying as president. So I'll show a little bit about the Convo Couch has been showing here. We'll come back to this. I'll come back to this as well. I just want to show Johnny over here talking about the voting process. He says the voting process in the NE autonomous region, hashtag Nicaragua, voters had to show ID, paper ballots, no VBN, had two election officials verifying and explaining how to vote. Voters were taking less than 5 minutes to vote. 16-year-old and older eligible to vote. So even younger than people here. People at 16 can vote. So I'm going to adjust the audio here so that you guys can hear.
Here we are.
1 second. And Johnny here is going to walk us through what he saw.
Here we are, another voting center station that is open and running very peacefully and running very democratically. Again, so CNN, New York Times, you are lying. So she just voted, and she said it took 2 minutes for her to vote. And this is what we've been seeing all across all the voting centers that we've been to. 8 minutes, 5 minutes, 2 minutes. So we want to enter a junta. Let's go into this number 2, because you already also went to number one before, well, I guess we need somebody to guide us, right? ¿Podemos entrar? Sí? Okay, gracias. Okay, so as you can see, this is junta número 2. And again, it's the same setup. This is a random one that we just went into. Paso went into this one. It's the first one. It's the same thing. So you can see this is where people vote. It's very secluded. You have your little box here. You have a pen there to vote. You have the ballots. Hola, hola, ¿cómo están? Perfecto. This is the roster. The roster. ¿Me puedes enseñar en una página? So mira, so look, people come in. They have their identifications, and then they have pictures of people's identification in there. They come in, bring their identification, show it, and then once they verify it, they give them the pen to sign. And once they sign, then they come over here to the other person who gives them the ballot. Ustedes usan el stamp, ¿no? Para el código, el número. So they use the stamp for the code number. They put it on the back of the ballot. They both sign off on the ballot. They explain how to vote, who and what races there are. And then they, and then the person can go over there, vote, fold it up, put it in this box, and then get their thumb inked. And then that's their proof that they voted. And that's everything. And they can't vote again. Oh, no, tú eres PLS. Yatama. Okay, there's 3 different parties. FSLN. 3 different parties there. So that would be like having Democrat, Republican, and a Green Party observing what's going on over here. They don't look at who's vote. They don't look at what the person's voting for. They're just seeing that the process is a democratic process and that everything is happening democratically. That they get the thumbprint inked on. Gracias. here we are.
So I could be wrong on this, but it seems like the communities are really small and everybody knows each other here. But other than that, the process seems really straightforward and secure. Um, so I'm gonna break this down with my guest, who I'm gonna have on in a little bit here. But this is what Joe Biden is saying. He's released a hostile interventionist statement on Nicaragua's free, sovereign, and democratic elections. So I'll read a little bit of this and I'll come back to it. What Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega and his wife, Vice President Rosario Murillo, orchestrated today was a pantomime election that was neither free nor fair, and most certainly not democratic. The arbitrary imprisonment of nearly 40 opposition figures since May, including 7 potential presidential candidates, and the blocking of political parties from participation rigged the outcome well before Election Day. They shuttered independent media, locked up journalists and members of the private sector, and bullied civil society organizations into closing their doors. Long unpopular and now without a democratic mandate, the Ortega Murillo family now rule Nicaragua as autocrats, no different from the Somoza family that Ortega and the Sandinista fought 4 decades ago. All right, we'll come back to that and we'll read the second paragraph as well. But from what I know, there are journalists in Nicaragua who, some of which are funded by right-wing groups in the U.S. Some of them are Trump supporters. And from what it looks like a lot of people are celebrating the victory of Daniel Ortega. Fiorella here tweets out, she's quoting what propagandists are saying about the election. Says there's no excitement for Daniel Ortega. Most people abstained, and many were forced to vote for him. But I mean, that's not what we're seeing here. People are recording him. People are celebrating over here. Let me find the audio for that so you guys can listen to the music. They're singing the public is with Daniel. The mothers, the children, they're all with Daniel. I mean, here we have some more. Nicaragua celebrate today's popular electoral victory following CSE's first election results bulletin. Sandinista singer Bela performs Vivir en Amor in Managua. Here's some more celebrations. Since imperialist goons and propagandists continue their lies, here's a thread of videos showing all the joy from Nicaraguan people last night as Daniel Ortega was reelected via a fair process, debunking their lies and attempts to classify this election as fraudulent. He says, y otra, another one. More dancing. I mean, it seems pretty obvious to me people are happy over there. And once again, looking at the voting process here. Here's Pasta. He was tracking this individual here and took the time it took for this person to vote. I'm just
Oye,
finding the
mira,
audio.
aquí, no, aquí está, bueno. Oye, mira, ¿cómo te llamas? I'm Medford. So you're voting today, right? Okay, we're gonna start the clock. You ready? Is it rolling? Bueno. ¿Cómo te llamas uno más? Medford. We'll see how long it takes them to vote. Bueno, I'll follow you.
Go for it. So we're just showing all the entire process of what it took for this individual to vote.
Eight minutes and 43 seconds from a man to vote. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. How do you feel? Bueno, gracias.
Bien, bien.
Bien?
Sí, bien.
Gracias. Thank you so much. 8 minutes, 43 seconds to vote. America, can we get to this time right here? 8 minutes, 43 seconds to vote. Look at that. Everybody. He didn't have to get pizza. He didn't order Chinese food. 8 minutes, 43 seconds. Gracias.
All right, and then they go on to say it took some voters in the 2020 Democratic primary, like the primary, over 6 hours to vote in the U.S. I mean, that's transparency there, seeing like the whole process that it took for this individual and for the other individuals that we saw in the other clips here. But regardless of that, and in addition to Joe Biden's statement, here we have the OAS is calling on the international community to demand the annulment of Nicaragua's November 7th election and for the holding of a new electoral process and 17-page report. So you can already imagine they're probably gonna send people over to look over the election, and it wouldn't surprise me if they do something to rig it against Daniel Ortega. For all the above, the international community must demand the annulment of the election on Sunday, November 7th, and call for the holding of a new electoral process with guarantees, electoral observation, and true electoral competition. I mean, they already had that, and we're gonna see the testimony here from other people who were there. Just going over here at Ben Norton's tweet over here, he's debunking this New York Times journalist saying Nicaragua is holding what it calls an election today. Daniel Ortega has prepared by arresting all credible challengers, shutting down opposition parties, banning large campaign events, closing voting stations en masse. Really now. So Ben says absurd fake news from U.S. government's mouthpiece, New York Times. Unlike this propagandist, I'm actually in Nicaragua reporting on the elections. I went to 4 different voting stations. They were all full with a totally calm, transparent process. There are 7 options on the ballot, 6 opposition. I mean, does it look like Daniel Ortega sent his goons over here? Everything looks peaceful over here. 1 second. My screen is a little frozen. I don't know if you guys can see that. I don't know what just happened to my screen. 1 second, guys. Let me see if me minimizing it will change anything. That's weird. Was I hacked or something? I know that Facebook accounts are being like censored for talking about the Nicaraguan elections, as what was reported on by the Gray Zone. Now I don't know what's happening to my computer here. Let's see if I go to another tab here. It's probably just that one tab that's cursed. Yeah, it's that one tab. Someone else who was there on the ground, Caleb Maupin. Let's hear what he had to say.
The government of Nicaragua has gone out of its way to encourage the participation of its population in the political process. They've lowered the voting age to 16. They have laws mandating that women be elected in the government and that 50% of the candidates of every party be women. They're doing everything they can to try and ensure that their people go out to vote, to bring their people into the political process. They have voter privacy. They have voter transparency, and when you look at this, the huge effort to bring the people, the broad masses of people into the electoral political process, this is far different than what we have in the United States. I mean, this is a government that is trying to advocate on behalf of the working class and the broad masses of people, and in order to do that, they have to have an electoral system that brings in the broad masses of people and encourages their participation. Look, in the United States, we have our elections on a Tuesday, not a national holiday. People line up for hours to vote before work. They line up for hours to vote after work. In the United States, there's whole regions, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Guam, that have absolutely no say in who is elected to the U.S. Congress or who becomes president. But yet, here in Nicaragua, in a socialist country that's demonized as a quote-unquote dictatorship by the United States, we see a much bigger effort to include people in the electoral process, a much bigger level of transparency, a much bigger level of voter participation, and I mean, this is ridiculous what we're hearing in U.S. media. I must say, you know, if you question U.S. elections and the integrity of the U.S. electoral process, if you question that, you get your Facebook account taken down, you get your Twitter account taken down. There's all this effort to ensure that no one's allowed to question the outcome of U.S. elections. But this election hasn't even happened yet. And the USA is already poised to put new sanctions on Nicaragua in response to these elections. They're basically threatening the people of Nicaragua. If you dare vote for a socialist leader, we are going to hit your country with economic sanctions. We're going to hurt your economy. If that's not election meddling, what is it? What is election meddling? You know, the hypocrisy of all of this is just astounding.
I mean, there's more from Caleb Maupin here. So here he has.
So
We've been
I'm
lied
here
to.
outside of a polling station in Chinandega, Nicaragua, and I must say it just makes me downright angry to see how our leaders have lied to us. I'm here in Nicaragua. It's election day, and today is a Sunday. It's a national holiday, and it's a weekend. They're doing everything they can to make sure that their people vote, to encourage their people to get to the polls, to encourage their people to participate. In the United States, we have our election on a Tuesday, and there's lines around the block, people voting before work, voting after work. There's every barrier created. But here, they have a very transparent electoral process. They are trying to get people involved in voting. They are trying to encourage participation. The voting age is 16, so people as young as 16 are able to participate in choosing the leaders of the country. The hypocrisy we get from U.S. leaders is ridiculous. You know, in the United States, if you live in Guam, if you live in Puerto Rico, if you live in any of the U.S. territories, you have absolutely no say in who is president of the United States. Now, could you imagine if Daniel Ortega were to pick a region of Nicaragua and say, oh, they don't get a say? That would never happen. That would never be tolerated. And the sheer hypocrisy of U.S. leaders who just go out of their way to demonize the elections of Nicaragua. It's shocking and horrifying. It's really, really shocking and horrifying, the hypocrisy here. It's really unbelievable. And the fact that, you know, in the United States, if you so much as question the electoral system, you can have your Facebook taken down. You can have your YouTube channel taken down. You can have your social media censored just for questioning the U.S. electoral process. But even though Nicaragua is having a completely fair and transparent election, regardless of that fact, U.S. media is endlessly trying to cast doubt and suspicion on it. And the CNN has lied about the election observer crew here and dismissed us and made it sound as if we are not legitimately overseeing this process. This is an open, transparent election, and U.S. media gets to lie and cast doubt about it endlessly. But if you question American elections, they shut down your social media. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. The hypocrisy from U.S. leaders here. This is a clear and transparent election. People are participating in the voting process. They have all kinds of mechanisms to make sure people aren't voting twice, to make sure that people are able to participate and exercise their right to vote. I mean, this is what we're being told in the United States just isn't true.
Yeah, unbelievable. I mean, showing U.S. still acting as a colony, not allowing Puerto Ricans or people in Guam to have a say in what the U.S. does, and then the U.S. goes even beyond that and tries to control other countries' elections that they don't have colonial power over. And then here's a video that Caleb has where he shows this individual here walking through the voting process. So adding on to what the Convo Couch showed in their footage. Here is Margaret Kimberly again with the. All right, there we go, and she pretty much speaks on what she saw and how it contradicts everything that the U.S. and the U.S. mainstream media is saying about how unfair the election was.
What we saw is in direct contradiction to what people in the U.S. are being told about the Nicaraguan election.
En breve, lo que nosotros vimos es una contradicción directa a lo que se le dicen al pueblo de Estados Unidos acerca del proceso electoral en Nicaragua.
The presence of our group and other companions has been vital in telling the people of the world about events here.
La presencia de nuestro grupo y de otros acompañantes ha sido esencial para contarles al resto del mundo lo que ha sucedido aquí.
I don't mean to be boastful in making that statement.
Y no quiero ser tachenta en hacer tal declaración.
My goal is to point out the degree of manipulation being orchestrated around the world by the U.S. government and others who would deny the Nicaraguan people their rights to self-determination.
Mi propósito es para señalar el grado de manipulación que está siendo orquestada en todo el mundo por parte del gobierno de Estados Unidos y otros que quieren negarle al pueblo nicaragüense su derecho a la autodeterminación.
The U.S. government passed the Renacer Act, imposing sanctions on the government, sanctions that will harm the people who freely exercise the franchise, all under the guise of helping them.
All right, and then one more here with Fiorella, who is also here. But before I do that, I want to add on here. Again, shout out to Kasochan News for putting all this information out. Coup plotting Luis Almagro unleashes on Nicaragua, urging OAS countries to respond to their clear violation of the Democratic Charter. The OAS releases a 17-page report on the strengthening democracy in Nicaragua, despite having no presence in Nicaragua. And lastly, I do want to show, well, I'll come back to this. There's just so much footage that's being shown out there by great journalists that are on the ground. I can break this down with my guest as I bring them on here. So I do want to introduce here Ramiro Sebastian Funez, who is a socialist journalist and communist. He has his own channel named after himself. He's also a filmmaker. He's been to Nicaragua. He's filmed a documentary on there. It spoke to several people that live in Nicaragua. So Ramiro, it's great to have you on here. What's up, man?
How's it going, brother? Doing all right?
Yeah, doing great, man. Can you hear me well?
I do. I hear you well, and I really appreciated the breakdown that you gave in the beginning with all the videos and screenshots, because it's stuff that we're not going to see anywhere in mainstream media. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, definitely had to add that context for people. So just real quick, just to give some context to people about what you do, you want to let people know about the dictatorship that you saw when you went to Nicaragua and when you filmed your documentary. What was the lifestyle that people had as they were living in Nicaragua? What did you see?
Most definitely. So thanks again for having me on. I'm a Honduran communist content creator based in LA. I went to Nicaragua twice this year, and I had some serious FOMO this whole weekend, a fear of missing out. When I saw all my friends, all my
Oh man, I know that
revolutionary
feeling.
comrades, like everybody, it's kind of like prom night, and you can't go to prom, and everyone knows at prom, and I'm stuck at home. So, but it's all good. You know, shout out to
Yeah.
everybody who was out there, to Caleb, to Fiorella, to Convo, to Kausachun, everybody who's out there doing amazing work. I went to Nicaragua twice this year, once in March and again in July for the anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution, July 19th. And both times I went was really incredible. I was able to produce this documentary, Nicaragua Against Empire, and I got to travel all across Nicaragua. It's sad to say, I think I know more of Nicaragua at this point than my own country of Honduras, where my family's from. And that's because Nicaragua is so much safer. Nicaragua is the safest country in Central America, and it borders the most dangerous country in Central America, which is Honduras, which is where my family is from. And Nicaragua is a country that is extremely identical to Honduras culturally, very
Mm.
similar, because we're talking about very small countries, right? It's not like South America where you have bigger countries. Like Peru's a huge country, Argentina's a huge country. Central America, the size of all the Central American countries together is about the size of the eastern seaboard in the US, if not
Mhm.
smaller. So it's like driving from it's like saying, oh, I'm going from DC to North Carolina to Georgia. That's how small and short the distances are. And even though Honduras and Nicaragua are so similar culturally and historically, they're so different in terms of the economic and political systems. In Honduras, you have a right wing, capitalist, pro imperialist government. You have some of the highest homicide rates, the highest poverty rates, the highest femicide in Latin America overall. Meanwhile, Nicaragua is among the top 10 most gender equal countries in the world, not just Latin America, in the world. And Nicaragua also has electricity for everybody. Over 99% of the country is electrified. The roads are better in Nicaragua than in the US, I'll tell you that much.
Mhm.
And there's also a lot of healthcare, free education, free healthcare, a very extremely low cost housing. There's housing units that are as low as $6 a month for Nicaraguans who are working class, who are from the community. So there's a lot of programs that benefit the people under 21st century socialism, under Sandinismo. It's not perfect. It's not a utopia. There's so many problems, and many of those problems are created by sanctions, which were just
Right.
imposed, as some of the comrades were mentioning in the video, the Renacer Act and the Nica Act, which preceded it as well. Sanctions that are stranglehold on the economy. But despite all of that, Nicaragua has been able to prosper and is happy and healthy. I think one of the things that has saved Nicaragua, one thing that I really didn't know about until I went there, is the importance of food sovereignty. Over 90% of what people eat in Nicaragua is grown locally and within 10 miles of where they're from. So they're not dependent on multinational companies, on Burger King, McDonald's, Pepsi, Coca Cola, all of that, and Monsanto. They're not dependent on those companies to eat and survive. And that's why they've been able to survive these harsh and brutal sanctions, because of their policies of self reliance, of socialism, and solidarity.
It sounds way healthier over there. And you mentioned that Nicaragua is not perfect. I bet you anything that if Ortega was replaced with whoever the United States wanted as president, things would be way worse. It would bring the country backwards so much, right? That they have to climb all the way back up in order to fix whatever destruction is brought by U.S. imperialism, right? So we see
Most
here
definitely.
we so I broke down I read a little bit of Joe Biden's letter here because he's not recognizing the elections in Nicaragua, saying that it's corrupt. So I'm just gonna get your thoughts on this second. I'm gonna finish up reading the second paragraph. The United States stands in support of the inalienable right to democratic self-determination of the Nicaraguan people and those of any other country in the hemisphere where popular sovereignty is compromised by the erosion of democratic norms, stifling of civic space, or violations of fundamental rights. The inner American democratic character obligates the hemisphere to stand up for the democratic rights of the Nicaraguan people. We call on the Ortega Murillo regime, that's what they're calling it, to take immediate steps to restore democracy in Nicaragua, and to immediately and unconditionally release those unjustly imprisoned for speaking out against abuses and clamoring for the right of the Nicaraguans to vote in free and fair elections. Until then, the United States, in close coordination with other members of the international community, will use all diplomatic and economic tools at our disposal to support the people of Nicaragua and hold accountable the Ortega Murillo government and those that facilitate its abuses. So putting into context all the videos that we saw, the evidence that we see of the election process, this sounds like a threat. It sounds like lies. And considering the election process in the U.S., the history of election integrity in the U.S., it sounds so hypocritical. And can you imagine if other countries were just calling the U.S. The Biden regime, or before that the Trump regime? So what do you want to say about this, Ramiro?
I mean, it's a complete joke. First of all, we're talking about a country that has invaded Nicaragua over 12 times. In the early 1900s, the U.S. invaded Nicaragua about 10 times. There was 2 other instances with Marines, with direct troops forcing elections on the country, quote unquote elections, also backing one of the most brutal dictatorships, the Somoza family dynasty that ruled the country for decades. During that time period, the U.S. had no problem at all with quote unquote dictatorship in Nicaragua. The Somoza family was propped up by the U.S. Nicaragua was used as a training ground for counter-revolutionary forces all over the hemisphere. A lot of the Cuban gusanos who participated in the Bay of Pigs and subsequent terrorist attacks on Cuba were armed and trained in Nicaragua because it's not too far from Cuba. And Nicaragua under the Somoza regime was horrible. It was violent. There was no free elections. Communists and socialists were banned. And since the Sandinistas have taken power, they've always had free and fair elections. They've had the support of the masses. And at this point, it's a complete joke. Just reading that statement, I mean, it seems like complete nonsense because it's not based in any sort of reality at all. We're talking about a government that had over 75% of the votes. Daniel Ortega is one of the most popular presidents in Latin America and the Caribbean. And it's something that I want to hear now address people, liberals and quote unquote leftists who are skeptical of Daniel Ortega, because there's a lot of people, especially with some boomers, no offense to boomers, there's some good boomers out there, but there are some boomers out there who are like, oh, I supported the Sandinistas in the 70s and the 80s, but Daniel Ortega, he held on for too long. He's a dictator. And so there's kind of that approach, right? And it's interesting because in one of the statements that you read earlier, I forget who said it, but it was interesting because that's one of the talking points, right? They say Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo and the Sandinistas, they oppose the Somoza dictatorship and regime. So they'll at least admit that the Somozas were a dictatorship and a regime, but then they'll subvert it and twist it. And they'll say, and now they've become just like them. Now they're equally as Somoza. And there have been pictures of quote unquote pro-democracy protests by these Nicaraguan opposition people. Well, they'll have a picture of Somoza on one side and Daniel Ortega on the other side and equating the two. So that has sort of been the liberal imperialist narrative about Nicaragua that has actually been dominant. I mean, you would have to go somewhere like Miami or even here in LA where I'm talking to you from, where there are some really right-wing Nicas who are very pro-fascist, they're like, I love Somoza, but they're actually kind of a minority, right? Like you have, what's her name in the media? She's like some Fox News commentator, and she's like openly fundraised for the Contras and all that. But then you have the more dominant, I forget her name. Well, I'll remember.
Navarro from, yeah.
Exactly. Like she's openly just pro-Contra. She's like, we need to get the Somozas. But then you have the other wing that uses feminism, that appropriates it, right? And subverts it. that uses feminism, uses environmentalism, uses and LGBTQ struggles, and finds any sort of incongruencies or contradictions within the Sandinista revolution, which there are. There are things that need to be worked out and that the Sandinistas are working out. But they'll capitalize on that. They'll spread that gap and they'll say Daniel and the Sandinistas are just as dictatorial as the Somozas. They're homophobic, they're transphobic, they're conservative, and they brand them, and it forms part of that perfect strategy of imperialism, of attacking the left from the left, of using the color revolution style, NED style approach. We have to remember that the president of the National Endowment for Democracy, Carl Gershman, who recently retired earlier this year, his first project was Nicaragua. He came into power in 1983, Reagan appointee, and he was the guy who came up with the whole Contra strategy and branding them as pro-democracy protests. So a lot of the stuff that we're seeing with the color revolutions, with the hashtag SOS insert country here, all of that was tried and tested in Nicaragua in the 80s and the 90s. And the class consciousness in Nicaragua is so high that the working class people, they see through it right away because they've been through it. They were the first ones to experience it. And they know what the synthetic left is. They know what the pro-imperialist left is. And they've overcome that. And that's why in Nicaragua, it's a mindset perspective shift. Because in the US, many people on the left feel embarrassed to stand by a leader, to say, I support this leader, whether good or bad, regardless of whatever flaws they have, I defend them. Because at that point, you're brainwashed, you're a tool, you're in a cult. But in Nicaragua and all over the global south, the same in Venezuela with Maduro and Chavez, and in Cuba with Miguel Díaz-Canel, people have their leaders and they defend them. And there's nothing wrong with that. So I think it's something that culturally to a lot of quote unquote liberals and leftists in the US who have a hard time coming to terms with the fact that Daniel is popular. He is a man of the people. They have to go to another country, go to other places and see how the perspective is different. People are not ashamed to openly defend their leader.
Yeah, I mean, if they didn't want their president, I mean, we're seeing that how secure their elections are, then they would vote him out. If he can stay there for as long as he wants, as long as that's what the people, the majority of the country wants, and it's none of the U.S.'s business to interfere in that. It's up for the country to figure out their issues. And speaking of people who are synthetic, inauthentic people, here we have all these politicians who try to act as if they're working on behalf of the people and what we want and that they're looking out for the little guys in the global south, because that's how they think of people in other countries. Ben Norton reported on this in a tweet saying that more U.S. economic warfare in Nicaragua. The House Representatives just voted 387 to 35 for the brutal Renacer Act, which will impose devastating sanctions on Nicaragua. So even more, the Senate already approved it. Bipartisan sadism is to punish Nicaraguans for not letting the U.S. colonize them. And there's a whole thread on that. They agree. U.S. imperialism is a bipartisan thing. It's supported by Democrats and Republicans. We got to see beyond this two-party illusion. And additionally to that, these people that call themselves progressives, like Ro Khanna, Katie Porter, and Jamie Raskin, who's from my district, they voted yes on this. And here's the article that goes more into depth with this. So, Ramiro, I learned a lot about you, about social imperialists like AOC, and some of these other progressives who try to act like they're looking out for us and that they're going to try to fight for peace in other countries. What do you have to say about this stuff?
It's a perfect example of why we shouldn't believe any quote unquote socialist or progressive who are praised in imperialist media. If you're a quote unquote socialist and you're being praised in the New York Times and MSNBC and CNN, something's off there, right? If the empire, the biggest imperialist forces, the energy companies, the banking institutions, the global capitalist elites, if they're backing you and supporting you and giving praise to you, something is off there. And that's exactly what we've seen manifest. We see these so-called progressives, AOC, for example, who met with Bolivian coup plotters after the 2019 coup in Bolivia. People like Bernie Sanders demonizing Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua. And all these progressives who claim to be anti-war, claim to be against empire, and they vote for military spending for Israel and also approve sanctions on Nicaragua. It just goes to show you that we have to, as Marx himself describes, move beyond the realm of appearances. Just because somebody has the title socialist or progressive in their name doesn't mean that they truly are that. And a lot of times, reality is inverted from what is portrayed in mainstream media. Because again, right, in mainstream media, Daniel Ortega is not portrayed the same way he was in the 70s. Because here's the thing, if you look at an article from Time magazine, I think in the 80s, it had a picture of Daniel Ortega on the cover with the gorilla outfit with the red and black bandana, and it said the man who makes Reagan see red, and it branded the socialists and the communists as a scary thing, as a revolutionary thing, as something that will disrupt a peaceful American conservatism. Now that strategy has flipped. Now the biggest threat to the global anti-imperialist movement are the liberal imperialists who brand people like Daniel Ortega and Maduro and Assad and Miguel Diaz-Canel as conservatives, as homophobes, as backward reactionary people, as dictators, as tyrants. The script has completely flipped, and it's something that we have to take note of, because if we're not aware of these strategies, then they're going to be used on more governments. One of the key institutions that has been crucial in promoting this is this institution called the Oakland Institute. And the Oakland Institute is some Soros-backed NGO in Oakland, California, a hipster paradise. And one of the things that the Oakland Institute has been doing is putting out stories, nonstop fake stories about how Nicaragua Sandinista government is oppressing indigenous Miskitu communities. Earlier, you had the video of the compañero who was in northeastern Nicaragua in the indigenous Miskitu homeland, which is an autonomous region, by the way. It's completely run by Afro-Indigenous peoples as part of the Constitution. So they have their own national sovereignty there. And the Oakland Institute has been claiming that the Sandinistas are engaging in genocide, that they're killing indigenous people en masse. Well, I went to that area. I interviewed people. I went to a school funded and created by the Sandinistas where they're promoting the teaching of indigenous Miskitu languages, where they're creating a whole new generation of Miskitu indigenous engineers and doctors and lawyers and cultural preservers. So it's a complete lie, and they're using, again, right, they're weaponizing identity reductionism. They're trying to use the indigenous angle, the women angle. A few years back, it was the canal, right? That if we build this canal that can rival the Panama Canal, that we're going to destroy the environment. So all sorts of strategies are being used.
It reminds me of what they were saying about Afghanistan, talking about women's rights. Oh, now that the Taliban's taking over in Afghanistan, like, what about the women, right? Oh, sure. What about the women that you've been bombing, right? That's a beautiful cat.
Oh, thank you. His name is actually Sandino.
Oh, Sandino.
Sandino the cat. But yeah, it's totally true, man. And the thing with Afghanistan is that a lot of the neocon Zionists who have been pushing for war in Afghanistan, Bill Kristol and all these other people, have understood that method is very successful, right? Because you're not going to convince people by using the strategies of the past. In the 40s and the 50s, in Guatemala, for example, the 1956 coup against Jacobo Arbenz and the United Fruit Company, it's like, we need to go in and take out communism and install capitalism in the United Fruit Company. That doesn't work anymore. That doesn't have good PR strategy and branding to it. Now it's all about using what's popular with the youth or what's being circulated, and they know that very well, and they're trying to do this with Nicaragua.
I just want to, these comments here will tie in to what I want to ask you here. Evidence violates community guidelines. Put up Katie Porter, who supports censorship on YouTube, who we were just talking about, voted yes on increasing pressure on Daniel Ortega. Thomas, Oklahoma, said AOC and the squad need to be called out and embarrassed by a real leftist journalist at a press conference. I don't know at a press conference. Okay, I was thinking, I don't know. I processed like in front of Congress, like another politician. It's like, yeah, that's not gonna happen. AOC is so naive. She probably doesn't care about her own people across Latin America. I mean, that's very apparent now. I mean, she doesn't say anything about how her people in Puerto Rico don't have a say in U.S. elections. So I want to ask you, Ramiro, who do you think is more dangerous? These right wingers that are more obvious about their stances and how they don't care about people in Latin America or anyone in the global South, or liberals or leftists that promote for censorship, which is now including the censorship that's happening to Nicaraguans on Facebook. People like AOC, who, as you said, she supports coups. She stood with the Bolivian coup leaders. She's not saying anything about this. She spoke against Maduro, saying that she stands with the people's freedom in Venezuela, and pretty much like picturing, trying to make Maduro out to be this like tyrant, saying that as if they don't have like a fair election process in Venezuela. But yeah, what would you say? Who do you perceive as more dangerous, or do you say that this is just how it is, and we just have to see through both of them? What would you say?
That's a great question. It's something I've been thinking about a lot. I think initially I would say that the liberal imperialist wing is the most dangerous. But one thing that I think is important to mention is the danger of the right wing evangelical Zionist faction in Latin America and the Caribbean, which I didn't really understand until I went to Honduras in 2019. At the end of 2019, I went to go see my family, and I can't tell you how many evangelical churches I saw with the flag of Israel, how many of these churches were Zionists, were had the US and Israel flag, were organizing spaces for the right wing Zionist conservatives. And this is dangerous. And this is something that in the US we don't really see too much of, right? Because we see a lot of the social imperialists, the quote unquote leftists, AOC, all these people, and they're very dangerous. Don't get me wrong. They own Silicon Valley, right? They censored the accounts of hundreds of Sandinista accounts that had thousands of followers. Like imagine one day, and I know these people too. I met them. I spoke to them. I interviewed one of my comrades, Camilo, who I met in Nicaragua. They had pages and channels with like tens of thousands of followers all over the world, and just like that, vanished. No strikes, no nothing, just wiped off. And that's a lot of work that goes into that. And this was, again, days before the election, knowing already this was a targeted attack, right? It's not like it was something that they said during the election. It was an orchestrated event. So I don't want to underestimate the imperial left violence, because it's Silicon Valley, it's the NGOs, the color revolutions, the NED, and that's very disastrous and brutal.
Yeah.
However, on the other hand, we have to keep in mind that within the right wing, the evangelical Republican right wing that represents the Somoza crowd, that represents that faction, it's very dangerous. What they're doing in Central America in particular is that they're using these evangelical churches to support right wing fascist ideology. For example, look at Bolivia in the 2019 coup against Evo Morales. You had Janine Áñez and these psychopaths who came in with the Bible and said that this is the new law of the land. They accused indigenous peoples of being satanic. They said that they worship the devil, that they were polytheists, and basically implementing genocide. We know in Guatemala during the 80s, another right-wing evangelical Zionist, Efraín Ríos Montt, who was backed, right, who helped train the Contras, who was backed by Reagan, backed by the neocon establishment. He also oversaw a genocide of thousands and thousands of indigenous Guatemalan Mayans who were communist, leftist, sympathetic, some cases not even political, and also using that same rhetoric, right, that is used against Palestinians. They're primitive, they're animals, they're barbaric, they're not holy like us. And we're also seeing this in Honduras with Juan Orlando Hernandez, the right-wing government that is implementing these free market neoliberal cities and wiping indigenous people off the map. Let's not forget that Berta Cáceres, an indigenous Lenca woman, was murdered by a right-wing evangelical Zionist government and many other activists. So the threat of this right-wing neocon, Israel-loving, Taiwan-loving faction is very real. And I think they're a little bit more discreet about it. And they're making moves in the background very softly, very carefully. Steve Bannon advises a lot of these people. it's a lot of the same people who are against China. They think China is like some satanic empire. So while I do think that on the one hand, the liberals, because you have like that one camp, right? Like the Russia hating liberal NGO granola, soy latte hipster people, and then you have like the right wing neocon Zionist China bashing evangelicals who are very dangerous as well. So I don't want to underestimate one or the other. I think right now the Silicon Valley liberals are definitely the biggest threat, but I think in the long term, the right wing neocons are also a threat to be reckoned with.
Yeah. I think it depends on the group also. Like if you're like in a group of a bunch of leftists, some of them may be some individuals may be overlooking what uh, what leftists do and the tactics that they use to try to infiltrate. And then sometimes the people that realize this start to focus too much on that they may overlook what the right is doing, and they don't pay enough attention to what uh, right wing commentators like or with right wing talking points like Tim Pool say. Like they overlook that stuff, and Tim Pool has a lot of followers, and he's manufacturing their consent, misinforming them. Like this is dangerous. So at the end of the day, we gotta keep our eye on both, the right and the left, and the tactics that they're using to try to manufacture people's consent for more imperialism. So you want to give a shout out before you head out about your? I want to hear more about your documentary,
Yeah.
and what advice you'd give to people who want to go out and do something similar and show footage about what's happening in other countries in the global south.
Yeah, most definitely. So basically, as I mentioned earlier, I went in March and in July. In March, I was able to produce the documentary Nicaragua Against Empire, and I traveled to three main areas. The first area is Managua, which is the capital, which is where a lot of the coverage has been based. The second area is Esteli, which is in the northern rural part of Nicaragua, which borders Honduras, and is home to the resistance against the Contras, because it borders Honduras. It's where the U.S. armed and trained the Contras, and Esteli, where I visited, was one of the places that was on the front lines of the resistance to the Contras, and is also the homeland of Sandino, and where a lot of the highest revolutionaries came from, Carlos Fonseca and others. So northern Nicaragua has a very similar class character to that of southeastern Peru, in the rural indigenous area where some of the biggest revolutionaries came from. And I also visited Bilwi, which is on the Caribbean coast, the northeastern autonomous coast. And I was able to interview and talk to indigenous leaders who spoke about the 5 levels of governance, where their leaders are elected bottom up democratically by the indigenous communities there. The Frente Sandinista has to recognize the results of the indigenous, Afro-Indigenous community elections that they have. And it was a really beautiful experience going there. I went on a delegation with the Friends of the ATC, the Rural Workers Association, focused on food sovereignty and campesino rights. And it was a really beautiful experience. I suggest anybody who wants to visit Nicaragua, go through the Friends of the ATC. Their website is online. They have great programs, and it's a lot of youth from all over Latin America and the Caribbean who go to Nicaragua to study agroecology, to study food sovereignty, to study what it means to be self-sufficient in terms of your sustenance, because that's so important. And it was a really cool experience. I also got to meet a former one of the most interesting interviews. I haven't released it yet. It's one of the last ones that I've been working on. I'm going to release it soon. I met a woman who was one of the Contra commanders. So she was one of the heads of the Contras, the US-backed Contras, who did crazy stuff, like chopping off heads, burning people alive, funneling drugs to the US. And unfortunately, a lot of them were misguided. A lot of them were orphans. A lot of them were people who had no other option, who were drugged, who were put into a very difficult situation and brainwashed. And this woman, she killed dozens of people. She killed Sandinistas. She was a Contra leader. And after 1990, after the era of neoliberalism, when the Sandinistas came out of state power, right? Because there was 2 stages, 1979 to 1989. the first era of the Sandinista revolution after the armed struggle. 1990, Soviet Union was dismantled, neoliberalism kicked in, elections were held, and neoliberalism was in Nicaragua for 16 years until 2016 and 2006, 2007, when Daniel Ortega came back as president. So in 1990s, when she saw all these neoliberal rollbacks, privatization, all these horrible things, rolling back all of the gains of the Sandinista revolution, she began changing her mind. She began supporting the Sandinista and is actually now in the Sandinista party. And you have somebody who was at one point killing dozens of Sandinistas to now being one of the top leaders. She's somebody who also represents Parlacen, the Central American Parliament. She has pictures with Daniel Ortega. And it just goes to show you that the Sandinistas don't have a grudge against people, even some of their fiercest enemies from the 80s, even people who killed their families. They're like, look, that's all in the past. Let's build, let's unify. That's why the government is called the government of unity and reconciliation, of national unity of all sectors of Nicaraguan society. And that's what the brilliance of Daniel Ortega and the Sandinistas has been, is bringing people together in defense of sovereignty, in defense of their homeland. So that interview is going to come out soon. I am really excited about it because it's a very unique perspective. Somebody who went from being in a far-right terrorist, drug, narco gang that was killing people to somebody who is now in defense of the Sandinista revolution.
Awesome, man. I can't wait to listen to that interview. Ramiro has a great show. I have his channel linked in the description. And you make me jealous, man. I want to go to Nicaragua too. You're talking about how you feel like you're missing
Let me know.
out.
I got you.
You got to be there twice, man.
I went twice and it was a blast. I went with my girlfriend Ophelia. We had such a great time. If you want to go to because a lot of times when you go to Latin America, and I don't know, I haven't been to Peru, but in a lot of Latin America, you sometimes having fun comes with the risk of going into dangerous places where there's a lot of violence or drugs. But Nicaragua is a very wholesome place. Like the best way I could describe it is like having fun at a family party where like there's no drugs, there's no like gangs, there's no crazy stuff going on, but you're still dancing, you're still having a good time. It's revolutionary, and it's still, they make socialism relevant to the people. So the best way I can describe it is wholesome, it's safe. And if you want to go, man, let me know. I'll hook you up. I can hook you up to go there. And if anybody else wants to go, it's not about what camera equipment. I literally have a tiny little Canon Rebel that cost me like $200 at B&H Photo, a tripod and a microphone. Together, that was like $300 tops. And it's all about talking to the right people, having the right story. That's all that matters. And especially nowadays with iPhones, like this is a television studio in your hand.
Yeah,
you can use this to capture great photo, and shout out to Fiorella, who's been getting
flashlight,
great
everything.
stuff out there. Right.
Yeah. All right, brother. It's great having you on. Check out Ramiro's channel. I'll have his documentary also linked. But yeah, Ramiro, it's a pleasure, brother. Thanks for coming on, man.
Thanks again, and keep up the great work, man. I hope everything goes well.
Man.
I hope they don't censor you, because it's getting crazy out there.
Oh man, it's getting harder and harder to escape that. But yeah, man, take care.
Take care, brother. Peace.
Peace.